Julian, you have worked for many years for indigenous people. What is your personal experience in this work?
Well, it's true, I have worked for many years because I came here in 1982, which was the very, very first meeting of the Working Group on Indigenous Populations. So that's really the first time that the indigenous issues were discussed at the United Nations in a more formal way. And initially I came representing an NGO, a British NGO, and then later I came in here and was recruited to the UN. And from around about 1990 to last year, was responsible for the work of the indigenous people. So yes, I've seen quite a lot. And maybe just in a very simple way, what has been achieved. I think two big things. One is the whole story of the Declaration. The fact that we started with nothing. We weren't sure what rights indigenous peoples or what rights should be recognized by the United Nations. In fact, there were many states which were hostile to collective rights of any of indigenous people. So we've really come a long way from that moment when there was this hostility to a complete endorsement by the General Assembly of a set of provisions which set out indigenous people's rights. It's a big achievement. It took a long time, but it's a big achievement. Now we know and we have very clearly what are the rights of indigenous peoples. But then in the other sense, there have been very important institutional changes in the UN. And of course, these are the things that we're experiencing here, like the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples' Rights, and so on. So we've got these three critical mechanisms, actually all of them with indigenous experts, either as members or, as we have now, a Special Rapporteur who's an indigenous expert. So we have really a complete change from the 1980s when indigenous people had no institutional space apart from the working group to very high-level, influential institutional mechanisms in the United Nations. So it's a great achievement, these two things, the normative or the rights that are now established, and then these spaces, places where indigenous people can really talk about their issues at the international level.
And you think that things are really changing for indigenous people after the adoption of the declarations?
Well, there are two kinds of changes. There are the kind of changes we see at the United Nations, and then there are changes on the ground, in the field, in the community. And, well, I think we can really measure some real progress at the international level in the way I described. But in many parts of the world, of course, situations of indigenous peoples remain stagnant. Rights are not recognized. Indigenous peoples live in great poverty and so on and so forth. All of the stories which we hear at this meeting and others. So we really know that, well, we have done things internationally. We've got good rights. We've got some good institutions. But we have always the question of implementing these, bringing about changes for indigenous peoples. So it's still a challenge, but I think there is some important change at the community level, and that is the fact that all of these issues are now very visible. We have people who will take up the challenge of human rights. It's not a human rights violation against indigenous peoples that is not immediately given visibility, and you've got all these mechanisms, and I think that's very important. We've got lots of spaces where there is opportunity to dialogue and to try and reconcile, as the Special Rapporteur said today, using the declaration as a kind of remedy to come and solve problems, not to sort of bang the states with them and say, but look, here's something, let's try to resolve things. So I think the situation is positive, but of course, if I take a book and I look at the statistics, and I'm, still very shocked to see problems of life expectancy, health, income, employment, and all these other statistics still looking very grim for indigenous people.
And which are the next steps that you think that the United Nations could do for go ahead for the indigenous peoples?
Well, I think they need to continue doing the kind of work we're doing in these meetings. But I think, and I argued this again inside my own office, that the real, if you like, the real game, if that's the right word, or the real work, is no longer in New York or Geneva, but in the countries concerned. And the UN has a lot of presence in many countries around the world, and now is the time, I think, to shift the focus to that work on the ground, to working with governments, directly with indigenous peoples, looking at how the different programs of the UN can play a role, whether it's education, whether it's health, development, and so on and so forth, and to see a much greater role of those institutions, those United Nations bodies, that can support indigenous peoples and improve the situation of indigenous peoples. It's not to say that there's no need for this international work, but I think, and it's my position, that the focus now should move a little bit away from these meetings in high-level meetings and discussions to practical programs at the country level that can bring about changes. We now know the legal framework, we now know what are the issues. We have a lot of technical understanding of the issues from indigenous experts over the years. Now let's go out and do something about changing it at the community level.
At your personal level, I think you are very sensitive about indigenous people. Why? You feel a native inside?
Maybe because I'm the exact opposite of an indigenous person. I was brought up in London. I have no sense of spirituality in the sense of feelings for my land. I've lived in about 15 different places in London, so if I'm displaced forcibly in London, I'm quite happy with it. So I suppose in one way that is a joking answer, but I think because when I started to work on these issues, I felt I was always learning something. And I haven't really stopped learning. I always feel that something is revealed, and it's not revealed about other people's, but about me and my own society. So, for example, when I hear how indigenous people practice decision-making and work together to try and find consensus, or even here when there are discussions amongst indigenous peoples, and I contrast it with our form of democracy, I think, well, my goodness, it's not us who should be going to indigenous peoples to impose our forms of decision-making and so on. We should rather listen to the consensual way that indigenous peoples work and bring that kind of learning into our forms of democracy. So I think what we have is there are lots of things about indigenous cultures which are things that we can learn from, and we should try to learn from them, and learning from them could make us do things better. We can't be indigenous, we can't do the same things because our societies are different, but there are lots of things to learn, and I mean I could spend several hours indicating the kinds of things that I think we can learn from, and I think that is something which I've always found extremely interesting, for me to learn, to feel, oh my goodness, I never thought about it in that way, and that's been, so in a way I'm very selfish. What I enjoy is what I'm learning as opposed to what I'm doing for others. So it's, you could see in some ways quite selfish work, yeah.
And indigenous people from Europe are not so numerous like other continents. Why, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, we don't really define indigenous peoples, as you know. We had a big fight about that. So we have the concept of self-identification. And in Europe, the only peoples, the only peoples who have self-identified as indigenous people are the Sami, who live in the 3 Scandinavian countries, and the Inuit, or Greenlandic people, who are, well, they're not really Denmark, of course, but they're part of the Danish crown, and so on. So apart from these peoples, we don't really have self-identified indigenous people. So numerically they're very small. But having said that they're very small, interestingly enough, they actually occupy quite a lot of what we consider to be the European space. And if you think about it, when we had all this discussion about the European Union, and Denmark was part of the European Union, and there was a negotiation on behalf of Greenland, and Greenland actually pulled out of the European Union, or Denmark remains, but Greenland pulls out. When we lost Greenland, we lost 50% of the landmass of what we understand to be Europe. So, and of course, if you think about the Arctic parts of Finland, Norway, Sweden, you're talking about quite a lot of square miles. So, of course, very small populations, but, nonetheless, important areas. And, of course, now with global warming, what is happening in these northerly Arctic or subarctic regions is critical.
I know that there are a lot of indigenous people that hide themselves in Europe, also in Italy. What can we do? What can do the United Nations to help these communities? Because they fear about the persecution that they had in the past. But how can the United Nations help these communities?
Well, maybe I'm understanding you. Maybe do I understand you're talking about, say, minority groups like
yes.
this, like language groups, linguistic groups that
There are a lot.
yes. I mean, of course, in Europe, I would say, I don't know, the term indigenous is a little confusing. In the United Nations, we have these two categories we've tended to use, indigenous peoples that now have a declaration and identify their rights, but we also have what are called religious, ethnic, national, linguistic minorities, which we also have a declaration to protect the rights of those peoples to profess their religion, maintain their language, participate fully, and so on and so forth. So within Europe, of course, we have a multitude of minority peoples. I mean, I know that I fell in love with the Italian language when I was 18, and I loved this language, and I said, well, I'm going to get a summer job in Italy to learn Italian. And I looked in the newspapers and I found a job in Italy picking apples. And I thought, this is perfect. I'm going to go to Italy and I'm going to pick apples and I'm going to hear Italian all the time and it's going to be fantastic and I speak perfect Italian. But when I got there, I was put on a farm in near Bolzano, which is in the South Tyrol.
Yes.
And everybody spoke German in this village. And I didn't want to learn German. I'd come to learn Italian, but everybody spoke in German. And they spoke some good English, so I was able to communicate. So I thought, my goodness me, I thought in Italy everybody spoke Italian, but here's a part of Italy where people are actually still speaking German for the historical reasons. So, well, of course, Europe is full of these distinctive cultures and so on. Some years later, since I'm being, personal, when my daughter was at school and she wanted to study Spanish, I said, I know what we'll do. We'll go to Barcelona. It's really cheap in EasyJet, or whatever. We'll go to Barcelona and you can hear the Spanish and, see the Spanish. And so we got to Barcelona. Of course, everybody was then very excited because, there was they were learning, everybody was speaking Catalan, everything,
Yes.
in the metro was written sortida instead of salida, so everything was written in Catalan. And I said to myself, don't look at anything, it's not Spanish, don't listen to anything, it's not Spanish,
Same in Italy. We have Gaelic, ancient Gaelic in North Italy, or in Brittany they have Breton language.
Yeah.
There are many communities, but they hide themselves. It's a pity because I think they are indigenous people also.
Yes, I think they are, in the sense that you say. The question is, will they self-identify in UN terms as indigenous, or do they perceive their? I mean, in other words, what have indigenous peoples achieved are rights to land, rights to natural resources, rights to self-determination, autonomy, self-government, and so on. Well, some of that, like Basque people or the Catalan people or so on, they have won autonomy and they have parliaments and so on. But I don't know about the land rights type question, whether this falls very easily into the category of Basque and so on. I mean, obviously, their rights are protected. They may want to say that, we are scared or something, but their rights are protected, and not just by United Nations declarations and human rights law, but within the European framework human rights as well. We don't have, strictly speaking, persecution of minorities. I mean, well, we may do in practice, but I mean, the laws are clear, so I don't think we have to fear that we need to develop new laws to protect those groups. I mean, I think they have to reivindicate and demand them and insist and so on. And that.
How you think to continue your work for indigenous people, if you continue?
Well, it's very hard not to continue to work because when I began working on this issue, it became not really a job. Although I was very lucky, they paid me very well at the United Nations, so I should be very happy. But I never saw it as a job. I mean, I have to say, I found it really like, this is fantastic. I loved coming to work. Towards the end, not so much, because our organization became very bureaucratic and rather conservative in its style of work. But nonetheless, I used to love it because I felt we were really doing something, and I didn't see it as work. I just saw it as, this is something one does, to help people and to...
This is why all the people love you.
Well, I don't know. But the thing is that, so what do I do now? I'm now teaching in a university, so I'm a professor in the university in UK, where we have a very well-known human rights center, which has trained a lot of human rights people, I mean activists, and we're working together. I'm doing a number of courses on rights, minorities' rights, indigenous rights, and so on. And I take up small jobs, to work with people, and so I stay in touch, and I come here and I try and follow some of the meetings and keep up with people. But I think the role I've taken for myself is to move from a kind of bureaucrat, a kind of, in a UN, which is institutional, which you don't have so much freedom, to now being a lot freer. So that means I can express myself in the way I think, following my conscience, whereas sometimes when you're speaking for the United Nations, you have to be a little bit neutral. You can't say, I condemn this country, it's terrible, and so on. We have to be neutral. So now I can say more or less what I want, which is great. So I have this additional freedom, and I try to do some writing and so on. So we'll see.
Nice.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Julian. Thank you.
Okay.